today, December 9th, Nicaragua officially cut ties with Taiwan, which is a huge deal. This is a very significant decision in Nicaragua. Nicaragua, after the Sandinista revolution in 1979, it did recognize the People's Republic of China in 1985. But then what happened is that when the Sandinistas lost power in 1990 and the US-backed right-wing president Violeta Barrios Chamorro from the Chamorro oligarchy, when she took power, she was basically just an empty slate who would do whatever the US told her to do. The US pressured her immediately in 1990 to break ties with the People's Republic of China and to recognize Taiwan. So since 1990, Nicaragua has been one of only a dozen countries in the entire world that still recognize Taiwan as an independent country. But today, December 9th, Nicaragua officially cut ties with Taiwan, officially announced that it only recognizes the People's Republic of China as the only representative of China, and Taiwan being part of China. And immediately, like 2 hours after this was announced at 4:30 p.m. Nicaraguan time, and 2 hours later, the spokesperson of China's foreign ministry, Hua Chunying, announced that China is holding talks with Nicaragua. So, I mean, this was clearly something planned. This is a very big deal. And it's also a big deal not only because this is part of the new Cold War, and like I said, only a dozen countries in the world recognize Taiwan as an independent country, but it's also a very big deal because we've seen reports in the past few weeks that Nicaragua and this Chinese company are going back to building an inter-oceanic canal. And you can bet right now that the United States is losing its mind, freaking out, because not only did Taiwan just lose one of the only allies it had remaining in the world, but now it's very clear that in the next year or two, they're going to restart construction of an inter-oceanic canal. What does that mean? That means that the US-dominated Panama Canal has a competitor, which means that China, Russia, Iran, any country that wants to do business with South America, that wants to do trade going through from the Pacific to the Atlantic, can now go through what will likely be a Nicaragua canal that will be bigger than the Panama Canal, that might even allow multiple ships to go through at the same time. And unlike the Panama Canal, will be a sovereign project that is controlled by the Sandinistas, a revolutionary socialist anti-imperialist movement. Whereas, let's not forget, in Panama, the Panama Canal, which was created by the US after the US basically carved off Panama from Colombia. Panama was basically a kind of US colony. Don't forget that the US government invaded Panama. And there's not much discussion of why the US government invaded Panama. Now, the excuse given by the US government was that the US had to invade Panama because Noriega, the former president, was a dictator and he was drug trafficking and he was corrupt and all of this, which is hilarious because Noriega had been a CIA ally. Like
let's not say ally. He was playing all sides. He was an opportunist, and he definitely had worked with them. But basically, Noriega was a complete opportunist in that respect. I don't want to go too far.
Yeah, I mean, he was involved in the Contra operation, helping smuggle drugs so that the CIA could fund the Contras with drug money. But the irony is that he outlived his usefulness, and then the U.S. invaded Panama in 1989 and overthrew him. But what's not discussed is that the significance of that invasion was also the U.S. invaded right before the Panama Canal went back to being owned by Panama. So it was also a way to prevent Panama from exercising sovereign control over the Panama Canal because the U.S. didn't trust Noriega because they had been using him to smuggle drugs and they knew that he was an opportunist who could go in different directions.
Well,
so now
he was also seen by U.S. intelligence as overly nationalistic. He was appointing people in his cabinet who were Black Panamanians who were nationalistic as well, and maybe too left wing. So there were actual the politics were getting out of control. And as we talked about before, the U.S. was sending a message to Nicaragua ahead of its 1990 elections.
Absolutely. So the fact that China now has official diplomatic relations with Nicaragua is huge. It also comes at the time when in Honduras, the left-wing Libre Party and the candidate who won the election, Samara Castro, she has said that if she said before the election that if she won the election, she would recognize the People's Republic of China. So that means that very likely Honduras is going to break ties with Taiwan and recognize China. And it comes at an incredible moment because this is at the same time as this so-called Summit for Democracy, in which the U.S. invited Taiwan to participate, which is a clear act of aggression against China. I mean, Biden claims one day that he recognizes the one China policy, and then he invites Taiwan to this democracy summit alongside sovereign countries, acting as though Taiwan is independent. And let's not forget what's an incredible, I mean, these U.S. diplomats continue to shoot themselves in the foot. Guatemala was not invited to the U.S. Summit for Democracy. Guatemala is not even a left-wing country. It has a right-wing corrupt government, but the U.S., the Biden administration has taken this Central America policy of putting a lot of diplomatic pressure on not only Nicaragua, but also on Guatemala and on El Salvador. So the U.S. didn't invite Guatemala, which is going to anger Guatemala. And if Honduras and Nicaragua recognize China, Guatemala will be the only remaining country recognizing Taiwan. So they're also very likely going to recognize China. China's probably going to build an inter-oceanic canal through Nicaragua. I mean, Central America could very well soon become a key part of the Belt and Road Initiative and a key region that's an ally of China. I mean, we're seeing a huge development in the new Cold War right before our eyes. And you can bet that in Washington, they're freaking out right now.
And Bukele was flirting with China last year before he kind of fell back into the U.S. camp. He's playing all sorts of games with Washington. He's seen as overly nationalistic. Honduras, we talked about Honduras before. I mean, we saw Xiomara Castro congratulate or accept congratulations from Taiwan's government. I don't think they're going to follow Nicaragua right away, but the card, I mean, they can play that card if they really want to go there.
Yeah, well, speaking of today, I mean, today, December 9th is a huge day because, I mean, it's in the history of Central America, it's going to go down really remembered. So not only is this the day where Nicaragua's Sandinista government broke ties with these ads, make it impossible to look at an article. So not only did the Sandinista government break ties with Taiwan, but also this is the same day where the U.S. formally accused El Salvador of negotiating with gangs, and the U.S. imposed sanctions on El Salvador today. So the U.S. has been talking about this. The U.S. imposed several rounds of sanctions today on Nicaragua. Here's an article that is actually visible. U.S. targets El Salvador officials in latest group of international sanctions. So on the same day, the U.S. did not invite Guatemala to its democracy summit, and they didn't invite El Salvador or Nicaragua. And Nicaragua broke ties with Taiwan, and the U.S. imposed sanctions on El Salvador. And I mean, Bukele is a mess. Like, this guy doesn't know what he's doing. I mean, he continues to recognize Juan Guaido as fake president of Venezuela, and he continues to constantly criticize Nicaragua. So he's alienating his potential allies. But at the same time, the U.S. There wasn't even a U.S. ambassador. The top U.S. diplomat in El Salvador recently left the country. The U.S. State Department withdrew their diplomat in El Salvador. So right now, the U.S. has no formal diplomatic presence in El Salvador. The U.S. is imposing sanctions on El Salvador. And last year, El Salvador announced that it had a $500 million non-reimbursable agreement with China. So China was giving $500 million for free. When they say non-reimbursable, that means that you don't have to pay China. This is free money. And China is building huge new buildings in the capital in El Salvador. So, I mean, the U.S. continues to they're not even using carrots. They use sticks to punish and attack these countries in Central America that support the U.S., like El Salvador and Guatemala, which is pushing them further into the arms of China. And now the Sandinistas are working with China. So, like, I mean, it's incredible to see. I don't know what they're thinking in Washington. Honestly, it's even from the perspective of U.S. imperialism, these are genuinely insanely stupid policies that the U.S. is taking, and they're pushing Central America into the arms of China, which is going to be great for the world, but bad for the US.
Well, let's talk about the canal really quickly. I think this is the most significant issue. The canal was going to link the Atlantic, I guess it would be the Bluefields area
Yeah,
to
which is the
through
eastern Atlantic coast.
through a freshwater lake, which is home to the island of Ometepe, one of the most kind of one of the most famous tourist sites in Nicaragua. It's a volcanic island inhabited by mostly indigenous people. Some of the roads there just are recently built. This freshwater lake surrounding it used to be home to some of the only freshwater sharks in the Western Hemisphere until an agreement between the neoliberal government in the 90s and the government of Japan that gave them fishing rights. And so goodbye freshwater sharks. And there was a lot of community opposition when the Sandinista government came in, working with a Chinese businessman to propose this canal, and some of the earth moving equipment was brought in starting around, I think, 2010, 2011. And all of a sudden a campesino movement developed to oppose this project, led by a woman known as La Chica Ramirez, Francisca La Chica Ramirez, who was always followed around by these human rights lawyers like Vilma Nunez, who is funded by the US. And it was pretty clear that this was a US project. This movement would come down. They had ferocious protests. They would, sometimes attack the workers laying the groundwork for the canal. And they wound up becoming the street muscle for the tranques, the blockades that really tore Nicaragua to shreds in 2018. So the 55 days of kind of bloodshed, protests, roadblocks that strangled Nicaragua's economy, reduced its GDP to basically its economic growth to zero in 2018, and resulted in the deaths of maybe some 300 people. That really started and emanated from the canal and this area around Ometepe, which is in Estado Rivas, in this state, Rivas state, that's close to the Pacific. So a lot of people, I think, might think this is insignificant, but this is, I think, the biggest issue. And the US was clearly involved in opposing it, exploiting legitimate environmental concerns of the local community and ramping up the conflict. And I wonder if we're going to see a reignition of that conflict, because obviously if Nicaragua is able to provide transit for massive shipping, like all the shipping that takes place from the Atlantic that needs to go to the Pacific, rendering the Panama Canal superfluous, I mean, that's a game changer. And if China is controlling that canal or has an interest in it, right in what the US considers its backyard, where Ronald Reagan once said a Soviet tank invasion of the US would be launched. It really does seem like something's brewing there. And so I guess my question for you is, like, will they even take it that far, and what would the US do?
Well, it's not the 1980s anymore. It is, we were saying earlier that it's more of a bipolar world than a multipolar world, but the US can't do a contra-terrorist war against Nicaragua like it did in the 1980s. I mean, they could try. They can't invade. They do have the Palmarola Air Base, Sotacano Air Base, in military base in neighboring Honduras, which is the largest U.S. military base in Latin America. And we did a report on that at the Grayzone, which you can find. Max and I went there in Honduras. But the reality is that the situation is very different now. And I think it's very possible that Russia might send troops. Russia might send military forces to Nicaragua to protect Nicaragua like it did to Venezuela. And this is not the 1980s. And China very likely will not send troops. China does not have a history of doing that kind of thing, but Russia does. And let's keep in mind, in the past few weeks, I knew something was brewing because there's been a drip of incredibly important news stories about Nicaragua. Here's an article in Sputnik from This is from November 26th, and it says Russian banks are funding the expansion of the international airport in Nicaragua. So when they announced that, I was like, huh, something must be coming, because Russia is going to help expand Nicaragua's international airport. And then a few days ago, a bombshell story broke, which is massive. Russia and Nicaragua announced on December 7th that they're working together to develop nuclear energy in Nicaragua. So, I mean, this is huge. Like, there's no nuclear energy in Central America. So, obviously, creating nuclear energy is a step toward potential nuclear weapons, which, I mean, that's a long way away. Who knows if that's going to happen? But I mean, it's clear that Russia and China are telling the US that we are going to protect Nicaragua. And if you look at this map here of the canal that is being built, you can see here near where it says Masaya in the map, that's the town near the capital, which is the red dot at the top, which is Managua. And you can see the blue plane is the only international airport right now in Nicaragua. But if they build the canal, they're going to build another international airport in Rivas, right near the canal, which, I mean, not only economically is this going to totally remake Central America, which is one of the poorest regions of the world, which, by the way, will also help to stop the mass migration to the US of refugees, because they'll probably come to Nicaragua looking for work. It's also going to help stop with the violence and the gangs, because there's going to be more economic opportunities. So not only will this be a game changer for Central America, but it's also going to be a game changer for international politics. And if Russia develops nuclear energy in Nicaragua, and potentially even, who knows, stores nuclear weapons in Nicaragua, I mean, we're talking about like a massive geopolitical tectonic shift.
Yeah,
That's kind of far, but like,
that's a little bit far-fetched, but we're already seeing developments that I think have accelerated much more rapidly than I would have expected a few years ago. And this all, I mean, I think this has to do with the US pushing Nicaragua too far, and them being able to actually use leverage. I mean, we're seeing what a multipolar world looks like, where small independent countries can actually exercise some leverage against what remains the major superpower still, at least the military superpower. And they're willing to do it because the US has pushed them so far.
absolutely. And you mentioned a key point, that in the 2018 coup attempt, the canal was one of the main points that the right-wing opposition was using against the government. Here's a long article I published, a very long article at the Grayzone, about the former revolutionaries turned right-wing opposition figures from the so-called MRS party, which changed its name from the Movement for the Renovation of Sandinista. They now call themselves the Democratic Renovation Union and UNAMOS. And this is the article: From Nicaraguan Revolutionaries to U.S. Embassy Informants, How Washington Recruited Ex-Sandinistas like Dora Maria Tejes and her MRS party. But one of the things I point out in this article is that the MRS party helped organize protests against the canal, using xenophobic rhetoric, claiming that Nicaragua was selling itself out to China. And this is ironic, because this is at a time when Nicaragua didn't even have formal relations with the People's Republic of China like it does now. And they had these protests. And if you look at this sign, I don't know what it says in Chinese, but in Spanish it says Chinese out. It doesn't say China out, because China in Spanish is China. It's fuera chino, which means Chinese out. It's this very xenophobic rhetoric. We don't want any Chinese people. They also wrote, here you can see in this tweet from this party, UNAMOS, which is this US-backed party of former Sandinistas who all became right-wing coup plotters. They said, we will not allow a Chinese invasion. So this is the rhetoric they were saying back in 2014. So you can bet this kind of rhetoric is going to be amplified. And it's the same thing we saw in Myanmar. In Myanmar, there were these protests, these so-called protests recently, where after there was a coup, and the military government in Myanmar is seen as being more pro-Chinese. And there were protests in which these people were chanting Chinese out, no more Chinese. and they were targeting Chinese infrastructure projects as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So, I mean, of course, the U.S. is absolutely going to amplify its meddling in Nicaragua, but I mean, what can they do at this point? All they can do is impose more sanctions on Nicaragua, but that's why Nicaragua is breaking ties with Taiwan and recognizing China, because Nicaragua is saying to the U.S., fine, if you're going to impose a blockade on us, like the blockade in China, or on the blockade in Cuba and the blockade in Venezuela, fine. We're just going to do business with China.
Yeah. And the Taiwanese government has also made a major miscalculation in trying to ramp up conflict over the Taiwan Strait, pushing the U.S. to the Taiwan lobby in Washington. By the way, Bob Dole died at age 98. He was a lifelong smoker. I guess, as the French say, the smoke cures the fish, because he lived so long. He was a tobacco lobbyist, but he was also the key figure in constructing the Taiwan lobby in Washington. And the Taiwan lobby has been working overtime to push the U.S. for recognition in a similar way that the Ukrainian lobby has been pushing the U.S. to intervene. And they miscalculated badly. Of course, they're not going to get that. And what we're seeing with what Nicaragua is doing is the de-recognition of Taiwan all around the world. Just this complete rejection from countries that have stood with them through thick and thin. And I should say, like, Taiwan provided valuable goods. I mean, they're a major export engine, and they were providing everything down to police gear to Nicaragua. And Nicaragua was willing to dispense of them. So I think that this just reflects how extreme Taiwan's government is and how much the Taiwan lobby is failing.
Yeah, and people have been asking me why the Sandinistas had recognized Taiwan for so long, and really briefly, I'll explain. So, like I said, the Sandinistas, after the revolution in 1979, in 1985, they recognized the People's Republic of China. And then in 1990, the right wing came into power after a decade of the contra-terrorist war backed by the CIA, and then also a U.S. blockade of Nicaragua, which caused tons of economic problems. So basically, the U.S. held a gun to the collective head of the Nicaraguan people and said, if you don't vote for the right wing that we fund, that we trained, that we're giving press coverage to, and we're writing all the press releases for them, if you don't vote for them, then we're going to continue terrorizing the country. So the people of Nicaragua were tired, and they voted in the right wing of Violeta Barrios de Chamorro, who comes from the most elite oligarch family. The Chamorros have had 7 different presidents in the history since Nicaragua, the modern republic, was founded 150 years ago. And since then, Nicaragua has had relations with Taiwan. What happened in 2007? Well, in 2006, the Sandinistas won democratic elections, and they came back to power. But when they rebranded in the elections in 2006, the Sandinistas were slightly more moderate. They rebranded as a kind of like very Christian, progressive, liberation theology movement that was not as revolutionary and radical. And they decided to more gradually implement changes. So immediately they implemented free healthcare and education and housing programs and jobs programs. But in terms of foreign policy and some of their other policies, economic policy, they were more gradual in implementing policies because they were afraid of really angering the U.S. empire. But they joined the ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance, along with Venezuela and Cuba and Ecuador and other countries, and they were pushing a progressive foreign policy. But one of the holdovers of their foreign policy from the neoliberal era, which was from 1990 until 2007, was their relations with Taiwan. Now, why did they wait from 2007 until now? I mean, a few things. One, as Max said, Taiwan was offering a lot of investment. Taiwan does this to Central America because Guatemala and Honduras are 2 of the only remaining countries on earth that recognize Taiwan. El Salvador, until recently, the FMLN leftist government in El Salvador broke ties with Taiwan and recognized the PRC. But Taiwan offers a lot of money to Central America, which is one of the poorest regions of the world. So, hundreds of millions or billions of dollars of investment in Central America goes a long way, considering the GDP of many of these countries is only a few $billion. They're very small countries and small economies. So in the case of Nicaragua, one of the biggest factors in the Sandinistas being hesitant to waiting so long to cut ties with Taiwan is that during the neoliberal era from 1990 until 2007, a lot of Taiwanese companies invested in Nicaragua, and there were potentially tens of thousands, or maybe I've even heard hundreds of thousands of jobs that were linked to Taiwan from either Taiwanese companies or companies that came in deals that were brokered by Taiwan. So the government was wary of breaking ties with Taiwan because it means that it could potentially lose tens of thousands or maybe even over 100,000 jobs. And of course, most of the people working in these jobs are working class people who support the Sandinistas, who vote for the Sandinistas. So if they lose their jobs, they might be angry at the Sandinista government. So the Nicaraguan government clearly made a decision that the U.S. refuses to recognize our elections, so screw it. We don't even care about, winning the approval of the U.S. or the OAS. Nicaragua's leaving the OAS. They already announced that. So screw it. We're going to lose these jobs in these Taiwanese companies, and unfortunately, that is going to do some short-term economic damage to our economy. But in the long term, China is going to invest much more. So it was a difficult decision. I had been talking to diplomats, doing interviews in the past several years. I had been asking people constantly. I was like, what is up with Nicaragua still recognizing Taiwan? And they said a few things. They said that the jobs were very important, and also Taiwan has invested money. And what happened with that money? The money from Taiwan was given, basically free money from Taiwan, basically just telling Nicaragua, we give you the money and you keep recognizing us. And then Nicaragua used that money to build houses, literally to build houses for poor people. There's a big housing project of very cheap subsidized housing, and that money came from Taiwan. And also another important factor that we should keep in mind is that diplomats would constantly tell me, they would emphasize that yes, Nicaragua from 1990 until 2021, it has not had diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, but the Sandinista Front as a political party did have relations. It had formal political relations with the Communist Party of China, and the Sandinista Front has been recently participating, even before announcing that they were cutting ties with Taiwan. Nicaragua was participating, the Sandinista Front, that is, was participating in events organized by the Communist Party of China. This is an article in Nicaragua's main public media outlet, 19 Digital, which it's the 19th is July 19th is the anniversary of the revolution. This is an article from December 1st, and it says Nicaragua participates in a forum by the Communist Party of China. So this was a week ago. So I mean, Nicaragua the Sandinista Front has had relations with the Communist Party of China, but this is a massive development that is not going to just influence Central American politics. I really think that in the next few years, this is going to be a huge development in the Belt and Road Initiative.
Absolutely. It sounds like the beginning of a major pivot point in Central America. I got to jump off, but I just wanted to raise one more issue about Central America that I think is essential to anyone who's trying to understand the region. And it's from Nayib Bukele, who's wondering if Max Kaiser and Stacey Herbert should be Salvadoran citizens after introducing Bitcoin to the country. So maybe we'll invite Max or Stacey on, or Anya. Anya's had Max on before to address this amazing development. I really would actually like to know more about the El Salvador nationalizing Bitcoin as a currency. But Ben, if you want to stay on and continue the discussion, I got to jump off because it's about that time over here.
Yeah, well, no, I'm going to wrap up. I'll just add a few points and then we can conclude here. Again, I just want to stress this. What we're seeing in Central America right now, people should pay attention. I know it's a small region, but it's important. This is an article from November. U.S. official says El Salvador relations paused for lack of interest. And this is, again, the US didn't even have an official ambassador. They had a charge d'affaires who was there, and she left. Right now, the US has no formal diplomatic relations with El Salvador. The US is imposing sanctions on El Salvador. The US refused to recognize the Nicaraguan elections. And I want to point out, this is not just propaganda. Russia has actually sent troops to Venezuela, which was this was in 2019 in March. This is a month after the US initiated the coup attempt with fake interim president of Narnia, Juan Guaido. I mean, Russia actually has been very clearly warning the US, saying that it's not going to tolerate the US invading Venezuela. I think this was an important factor. Here's another article in September of 2019 in Reuters. Russian military specialists arrive in Venezuela to service equipment. I don't think it's actually, I mean, the nuclear arms thing, I don't think that's going to happen. But I mean, I just raised that. Who knows where things could go? But I actually do think that there's a very real possibility that Russia could potentially send military advisors to Nicaragua. In fact, right now, as we speak, there's an important high-level Nicaraguan delegation in Russia. So not only did Nicaragua announce today that they're recognizing the People's Republic of China, this article was published today, December 9th. Russia and Nicaragua strengthen bilateral ties on nuclear and other issues. So Nicaragua is very quickly going to become a huge thorn in the side of the U.S. When it comes to the new Cold War, Nicaragua is very clearly going out on a limb. The Sandinistas are saying, we are now the best friend of Russia in Central America and probably going to become an important ally of China. So we constantly at the Grayzone, we talk about the new Cold War. I mean, Nicaragua has just stuck its neck out and said that, like, we are going to stand up for our sovereignty, and we're going to have two big brothers who are going to help protect us from the U.S. empire that constantly tries to overthrow our government, imposes sanctions on us, meddles in our internal affairs, and we're not going to tolerate it anymore. It's a huge development.
Yeah, and a return to the state of play in a lot of ways prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, it was the Soviet helicopters, the Hind helicopters, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, that provided the Sandinistas with the muscle to launch Operación Danto, the final push in the war against the Contras that led to that brought the Contras to the table and led to their defeat. The Sandinista army was trained by Cuba and the Soviet Union. So Nicaragua has always looked for international partners to defend itself against the U.S. empire that invaded it in the 1930s and murdered its national hero, Augusto Sandino. So history repeats itself in a lot of ways, or history strikes back.